with the gold star.
I get extra
Chair.
credit, right?
For your sins, you've been given the gold star.
Okay,
Okay, now we
so,
have to shift gears all
are we
together.
live?
Yes.
So, as the committee probably knows and the public probably knows as well, we've been getting some requests from the money committees to find more money, which leads to the question of whether we can do more than just study the sports betting thing, which has a range of $640,000 to $10 million, depending on the first or second year. I'll be honest, even though I was primary sponsor or one of the primary sponsors of the sports betting bill, the initial introduction we had on this bill made me think it was very complicated and hard to put together with a lot more time. But I've asked Tucker and the commissioner to come together to see if they can propose something that could hit the ground running. One of the concerns I have, in addition to not being able to do the kind of due diligence we might otherwise have if it wasn't April, is I'd like the legislature to maintain some involvement and control over decision making here and not do a wholesale delegation to the administration to stand up the program. So I don't see the commissioner here. Is she going to come back? You know?
She is. She is.
Okay. So I asked last week for the commissioner to meet with Tucker and see if they can somehow adhere to those guidelines and come up with something. And I did get, I think last night, a draft. I'm not sure necessarily we want to focus on the draft so much as to understanding what's in the realm of possibility. I do think that.
I apologize.
It's okay. I do think that, I think there is a section in this bill, alcohol bill, that deals with liquor and lodging.
Hi, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I was having trouble with my screen, so I messaged, but here I am.
So we're trying to, there is a section of this bill, which I think it might be appropriate to add something more that could be implemented quickly rather than just studying the situation. And that would, to the extent this bill hangs around this committee for a couple of more weeks, we could potentially take some more testimony on the sports betting thing and maybe feel more comfortable with it. And that begs the whole question of what happens when he's here, because we know for years the House has been strongly opposed to sports betting. I hope that may have changed given the number of states that have now joined in protecting some of their revenue base. So that's a long-winded explanation to turn it over to these folks and tell us about your discussions and what you may have come up with as a paradigm here.
Sure. Good morning again, Tucker Anderson for the record. To set up, as Senator Sorokin put it, what is in the realm of possibility. When we did the brief overview of what is happening in the states broadly and what the sports betting markets look like right now, the first thing that I highlighted is the major choice initially is between state-run, state control models and then open market licensure models. And one of the key differences between those two, at least for what is on the table right now, is a factor called speed to market.
Say that again?
Speed to market.
Speed to market. Okay.
So speed to market is, in many cases, an important factor that is considered for how quickly can you stand up the regulated market and get it in place. And one of the key reasons this is important is because the revenue within this market fluctuates fairly dramatically depending on the type of sports leagues that are in play at the time that the market is stood up. And you can look at revenue results from each of the regulated markets month by month, and you'll see that Basically, the NFL season is the most important season for higher revenue during the fiscal year for the sports betting market. And what each state has really tried to do is to try to target the fall as the date that their regulated market is live for. Because if you miss that window, it becomes difficult to raise those higher revenue levels. Another thing that I highlighted that's important to consider.
Can you just as a working number, and I promise I will not hold you to this, but is there a, if you miss the NFL season, are you, on an annual basis, are you losing 75% of your revenue or 50% or sort of a rough thought you make the statement that you really want to get in the door for the NFL, but how bad is it or how good is it, you know, in terms of the percentage of the sports bet market is attributable to NFL bets?
So I haven't looked at the variation statistically in each of the state revenue reports.
Right.
The share of sports betting, you have two people in the room who might be able to give you hard numbers, is around 70 to 80% of the bets that are placed during, let's say, a 6-month period from September through the Super Bowl are NFL bets. So that's a huge share of what is known as the handle that ends up governing what is net revenue for the operators and then taxable revenue or revenue share for the state. And the amount of betting that happens after the NFL season declines typically.
Only in this country.
That's true. I have not looked at the revenue models from Australia and Denmark.
I know, I mean, you know, cricket and football, I mean, English football.
Cricket.
And cricket, I was gonna say cricket.
The other
Those are the other
important
big markets.
factor here that determine the model in front of you is that I described it as blank page, open book for Vermont. Really anything is on the table because there are no tribal governments or compacts that would have to be negotiated before you stand up the market, right? There's not a huge wagering market that exists right now, so you don't have ties to particular mechanisms. There's not a lot of statutes that would have to be changed. But on the flip side, that means you don't have very many structures in place right now that you can leverage. And I highlighted a couple months ago during the initial discussion of this that, you know, a state like Colorado, where there are major sports franchises and casinos, they used the casino licensees and the racetrack licensees as the master licenses.
Right.
And they used those to then set up all of the subordinate licenses that came in. In Vermont, you don't have those casinos, you don't have that master license opportunity. So balancing structures you have with speed to market, this proposal takes a look at the one structure you do have in place, which is the Department of Liquor and Lottery and the lottery system. And the way that the proposal is structured, it takes the majority of S77, which was introduced by Senator Sears and some co-sponsors, including Senator Sorokin, based off of the New Hampshire model, where the state would be the primary or master licensee. So the bill authorizes DLL to operate sports wagering through agents. Those agents would be your sports betting operators, which would include, for example, DraftKings, Caesars, whoever is going to bid to become the agent. And the DLL would then regulate effectively through contract with these parties. The bill sets up minimum requirements that the legislature wants. They're taken from an S77, includes security, minimum internal control standards, requirements for house rules, things like this. And then provides that the department could adopt procedures. It would govern, based on these minimum standards, what would be required both for the operation of the market, so how it's carried out day to day, what the operators have to do to be legally compliant, but also guidelines for a request for proposal procedure. In S77, it was proposed that there would be a maximum of 6 agents at any given time.
Right.
It's important. The reason it's important is that there are, let's say, 650,000 people in Vermont. There's a share of those that will participate in the market. And the more operators you have, the less their liquidity pool is for being able to offer products and leverage the amount of money that's coming in, right? And increase their revenue, which would then get shared with the state.
So this is it sounds like a public-private partnership, but it's mostly private. I mean, just basically, there's a governing body in DLL, but everything else that's done in implementation is contracted out. And what's the other major model? If that's the public model, what's the private model?
So first, there are 2 public models. The one we just went over,
Right.
and then there's the lottery model. There's a minority of states that use the lottery model. And what happens there is the state actually does everything itself. And there is a high level of volatility and risk for the state to implement its own lottery system. And the recent example is Washington, D.C. with their, I think it's called Gambit system. And they've seen what risk it can do to revenue if the state is operating its own system.
Which also doesn't seem to be speed to market very good either.
It took DC 18 to 24 months to be able to stand up their own system.
Right.
The other side is the licensure side of things, and you have a lot of variation there. Again, states that have casinos use casinos and gave them authorization or set up a new subordinate licensing structure under those casinos and racetracks. There's a lot of analysis, particularly from the University of Nevada, saying that open market licensure is another model that could succeed. That would be establishing license barriers. You know, you must meet these qualifications, and then just opening the market.
So I'm trying to understand the difference between the licensure model and a public model, where the public model is really nothing more than contracting out under an RFP, which probably would have the same guidelines in which you would have in granting the license. So what's the difference whether we have 6 licensees or 6 contracts with the state?
The fixed terms where for the operators, right? So on the public side,
So, sorry, operators the same as agents?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. I'll
No,
try
I'm
not
just,
to muddle too many terms. There's a lot of them out there for what these sports wagering providers are. So in the state control side, administrative agency of regulatory authority fixes everything by contract, including the revenue share.
so the revenue share is determined by the legislature, I would assume, and carried out by the,
In this case, the revenue share is fixed through a bidding process. Those that want to operate, want to be agents for the department, will include in their proposal, this is how much we will offer in revenue share to the state. To give you an idea, I believe in New Hampshire, that's 50 to 51% is what the revenue share is for their operators. New York also went through this process, and there's a similar rate there. New York, a little different in that they had a variable tax rate in their request for proposal procedures. I won't get into the weeds here, but
Okay, we do need to, maybe not today, talk about, revenue. I assume collection of revenue can be based on the bidding process, but it could also be established in statute that a certain percentage of the handle,
yeah,
like if we want to do a 6% sales tax on these services, we could do that or something like that. I mean, the tension here is,
There's a lot of
Mark is right, is speed to market versus how much legislative decision-making do we want? Well, I don't know if that's the tension, but there is the issue of how much decision-making we want in statute versus how much we want to delegate to, if we do the DLL contracting method, how much will allow them to make those decisions and whether we put any parameters on at all.
The other distinction between licensure and this model would be barriers to entry for the operator. You have an RFP where the department is, at least during the initial phase, selecting the agents that will be operating within the state. They're taking in these requests, they're determining who the best partner for the state is going to be to offer. And they're selecting qualified applicants based on that initial RFP guideline that they send out and say, this is what you need to do to be selected as a qualified applicant. That barrier is set up initially. It's determined by the contracts and the RFP terms.
Right.
Under the licensure model, the barriers to entry are determined by a mixture of statute and rule set out ahead of time. There might be a cap on the number of licenses issued, but ultimately the barriers are determined, and anyone who gets over that hurdle can apply for the license and be selected to offer services within the state.
So what your research and what you've seen so far, I'm guessing that the contracting process is a much more expeditious one than for us setting up a licensing procedure criteria and then having a review process by some board as to whether you meet those terms. I would think.
It's faster in general terms, and it targets another
Sorry,
factor.
the public model, the
The public
contracting
model
is much faster.
can be stood up faster. That's the speed to market. Another factor that this sort of process focuses on is market liquidity, because that can be negotiated under the both administrative procedures that be adopted, but also the terms of the contracts between the parties. And the market liquidity is how much in this partnership of the market share in the state can you bring into the legal market? How much can you bring in, not just for the revenue side, but also for the integrity model side? Are we able to keep track of where bets are going to see whether there's irregularity with a particular sporting event? How do we monitor compliance?
Yeah,
The
what's
more
the
that
whole
you-
enforcement piece and monitoring piece here?
All of that, there is in this bill a specific requirement for monitoring and enforcement by the Department of Liquor and Lottery of all the agents. There's also requirements within the guideline adoption procedures for internal controls, security, and monitoring of each of the agents. So when the request for proposal comes in, each individual agent is going to have to say, this is exactly how we can work with the department to facilitate monitoring.
How many more department members would this take to monitor and oversee?
I can't speak to the compliance piece of it yet, because I haven't analyzed that. We are actually in the process of looking to hire what we call a director of strategic initiatives, which would be someone that's looking at these lottery initiatives. To give you an example, New York State has one person to do this sports betting. One, just one. And they have 9 operators right now. It's out of 51. They did a matrix where if there were only going to be 2 operators, the rate would be 64% as an example. If there were 9 operators, it would be 51%. So the reason why as Tucker's describing, we were speed to market. How do you create, a structure? If we're looking to get this passed this year, how do you create something that gives the department the ability to stand up the program through RFPs and contracts, through procedures, much like we do on the lottery side where the board gets involved. But have those provisions in place. So there's, criteria here, the guardrails. Also, we made sure that there were industry standards that needed to be met. And so that's been built in here as well.
As you look at what other states have done, are there any models that can effectively be copied?
Yes. And
And with sufficient details so that all of the stuff that we would have to do on the front end has been done and has been vetted and has been tested?
So S77, as it was introduced, actually took almost verbatim the New Hampshire model and incorporated it. And some of the changes that are within the draft in front of you takes that.
We don't have a
New Hampshire
draft in
model.
front of us. I think I was the only person who got a copy of that.
We have,
I thought that Scott was.
Oh, maybe you mailed it to the whole committee, I don't know, but
no, we don't.
I don't even have it. Okay.
All right, so
I don't want to get into, I mean, I do want to get in general to talk about it, but I don't want to look at a bill just yet, so.
the answer is yes, because this includes all those provisions from S77 that were taken directly from New Hampshire, and it builds in also almost directly the RFP process that was used in New York, which was
You didn't use the Washington model.
well, the Washington DC.
Yeah, no,
It's not.
Okay.
And Washington DC, I will say, is the most complicated of the models because while the territory itself is controlled by DC, the district, there are licenses available to individual operators, but only for on-premises mobile and retail wagering, and only at specific locations, and only if they meet certain labor agreement requirements.
Okay.
And right now, I think it's just the Capital One Sports Arena.
So how fast was New Hampshire? in this bill?
I actually don't know what their speed to market was. New York was pretty fast.
Yeah, New Hampshire was within 60 days, right?
What?
Right, but I thought you said that one of the factors of speed to market is basically existing structures that already exist, and we're sort of a blank slate here. So they, New York may have had some advantages over what we can do. That
Well-
they piggyback on the gaming commission or something.
Plus, they had all that off track, they already had a whole bunch of stuff in place that we don't have in place, right? I mean, they had
So-
off-track betting, I mean, they've had a whole bunch of stuff for years.
The interesting part about New York's speed to market and their RFP process is that they actually had quite a few barriers to entry built in. So first of all, they have casinos. And one of the things that states have looked at is, are we gonna have some cannibalization of our existing gambling markets? New York requires that the operators, there are two, platform providers in New York that are selected through the RFP process. They had to locate their servers in the casinos, they had to pay a fee for the location of those servers in the casinos, and they had to pay a $25 million initial fee just to be selected as a platform provider. And the RFP process still moved very quickly.
And to your point, Senator Brock, we do have models. Obviously, there are 32 states, right? So there are models that we've looked at, New Hampshire and New York, for example, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Those regulations exist, those procedures exist, those RFPs exist. So we're not starting from scratch. There's things that we can use in the development of our procedures, right? With this framework envisions us with the administrative procedures, which is less time consuming. So we definitely have models to use.
Let's just sort of frame this a little better for me. When we talk about this bill, I had envisioned the real area that's ripe for development is online sports betting. Are we talking more than mobile apps here?
Isn't that all online sports betting?
Yeah, that's what I don't know whether we're talking kiosk or sports books or that kind of stuff, just the,
This is just online, and that's an important note for whenever we do go through this proposal versus S77. S77 did have the opportunity for lottery locations to also offer essentially kiosk-based
Right.
sports wagering. That has been taken out in this proposal. It would just be your online and mobile sports wagering levers.
so just let's, I got a little, I don't know, confused is not the right word, just, what when you were talking about 50 or 51%, we're now talking about a little bit of the revenue side of it. What, is there, in the thing you sent out, is there like a blank space there as to what the tax rate would be, or is that in the, that's gonna be in the RFP, a negotiation between?
In lieu of a tax, the way that these states operate is that there is a revenue share built into the contract, and it's figured out through the bid process. It's one of the criteria that, at least in New Hampshire and New York, the agency has to consider when they're selecting the agent. How much are you gonna get the state out of your potential revenue? And first of all, and
So
this
you
is
mean
built
that,
into
so how many operators do they have in New Hampshire? You know?
One,
they're permitted up to 3.
Up to
but they want
6,
up to
I think.
6.
there are.
So the tax rate has been negotiated in that one contract. And New York, they have more than one operator?
9, I said they had.
So New York has nine operators, and the revenue model is 51%. So New Hampshire had a similar.
Oh, I thought the revenue was negotiated.
So the way New York State did it is they have a matrix, and it was in part of their RFP process. And the matrix was, if we select 2 operators, your tax rate is going to be 64%. If we select 10 operators, your tax rate is going to be 51%.
But every operator selected would wind up under the same tax rate.
Correct. So all of the 9 operators, they share 51% is the model, the revenue model. But that was predetermined. This is, in the RFP, here's your matrix, you agree to this or not. That was one of the conditions for the RFP.
And revenue in this case is profits. It's not
Yes.
half, it's not half, they're not giving
And
51% of the total that's made.
one of the biggest areas that will have to be negotiated is what are the terms of that gross revenue going to be for purposes of the revenue share, and that will have to be fixed through the contract. And if you go state by state, you'll see that the majority just say that it's adjusted gross revenue minus federal excise tax and winnings paid out. There are other states that allow adjustments for promotional credits, and that might be something that is negotiated as part of the contracting process. Are the operators, the agents in this case, going to be permitted to give out promotional credits to try to, at least in the initial phase?
So just so we're talking the same language, if it's a 51%, it's 51% of the amount of money they take in, less the amount they pay out.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Uh,
And there is a definition in this proposal for what the base gross sports wagering revenue would be. And it's the amount of total receipts from sports wagering, less money paid out and less any federal excise tax that needs to be paid by the agent.
The money to be paid out by each one of the providers, is that uniform?
So the winnings you're talking about, there's nothing in this proposal that would require that. I'm not sure if that would be fixed.
No, different providers in effect have different payout rates.
Right, and
And with the buyer, the public would better know that if I bet with agency A, I'm gonna get a higher bet payout than I would if I bet with provider B.
I'm not sure if that gets built into what's known as house rules, which are essentially the terms of the bets between the bettor and the wagering provider.
I mean, I assume it would be competitive on the one hand, but if you could do things differently, and then again, one of the questions would be, what's the disclosure to the customer?
I know that, for example, with slot machines and the river gambling boats and terminals in Indiana, there's a required minimum percentage. In Indiana, it might be 81%.
Seems like there's a threshold that they have to meet.
You have to meet that 81% payout, 81% of the time. There has to be some.
So,
I haven't seen that in any other states so far, that there would be a required payout. In big picture, when you're diving into this area, sports wagering really is a separate category of this type of gambling. And the reason is that this is essentially a contract between the bettor and the provider. I'm going to give you money, and we're going to have an agreement based on some contingency out there Tyreek Hill, Miami Dolphin, catching 25 touchdowns this season. And upon the happening of that event, our contract said to pay me, and there are all these terms that come in between for how you accept my bet, how you cancel it, and all that is governed by what's known as house rules. Those are typically agency approved.
So the provider is, the operator is the agent. Okay,
Yes.
so we now have 3 terms. For what?
Okay, take another stab at my question. I think it's the same question. I'm trying to understand the difference between the RFP contracted out process and what the licensing process would have as the requirements of the licensee. Wouldn't they be very similar, what you're asking in a contract, what you're asking for someone to come forward as minimum requirements for a license?
They would likely be very similar, yes.
So what's the fundamental difference that some people would not like the state to have the power to contract rather than come in and just see if they can get a license?
How about the process for license revocation? The privilege that has been granted to a particular market operator with their license to be able to continue their operations contingent on statute and rule telling them what they have to do to maintain their license. And then the opportunity, for example, for an appeal process if that license were to be revoked.
So that could be more threatening or oversight than a contract where the state could come in and say you're violating.
You're violating the contract and it's void.
Is there a possibility, I know we're getting way ahead of ourselves here, of if we did the contract model, that we could do a contract for 1 year, the next legislature could review where we are to see if that is working for us?
Yes, a section could be built in that, a legislative committee or subcommittee could receive the current contracts and determine whether that model can go forward. And the reason that's possible is that whatever is here could be superseded or repealed by the General Assembly at any time. You can move on to another model
Should you think about this as a pilot
or
for
a sunset.
X number of years? Because it does,
That's sort of what, I mean,
Yes.
to go forward in this period of time.
It's really a
I
challenge.
think we're not going to be able to give it the kind of due diligence we would. And, in some of these areas where we give due diligence, it's probably not necessarily the best thing to do, sort of let the marketplace govern it. But
well, and
it just seems kind of hard to get into the level of detail in the time frame we have. So we're gonna have to delegate that. And what kind of oversight do we have? And the ultimate oversight is not locking ourselves in for too long to something that could be a failure. I mean, I hear you say they have 1 person, but it strikes me you're gonna be going up against some very heavy hitters here, a very unsophisticated state. You're gonna wanna hire consultants and professionals to negotiate these RFPs. It's not going to be as easy as hiring 1 person to look what we're doing with marijuana.
Right.
There's boards and advisory councils and experts coming in, and in some ways, I think this is probably more complicated than marijuana. What the product ultimately is, but I mean, that's a tension I feel. I just. I don't know, maybe it's all, the template's there and we just plug in what
So-
New Hampshire did, or what New York did.
Well,
and we just
easier.
Go forward.
that's just this body. If I were a betting woman, which I'm not, the House is a big bet. And whether the House is interested in this, they've been very reluctant to add any form of betting or lottery or, so, I mean, just getting the sports betting study through the House, the study has been a challenge. So if I were a betting person at the moment, getting this through in 3 or 4 weeks, it's like, well, I think I might actually wager on this. And it wouldn't be that we would be setting something up by this fall.
So let me, Is there, in terms of the revenue side, in a contract, well, it sounds like when New York did it, the legislature actually did, somebody set the rate. It may be variable based upon the number of operators you have, but it's not like you go into a contract negotiation and say, I'm gonna give this to the highest bidder who gives me 70%
Right.
of the thing. And that's the negotiation. That thing is still retained by the legislature in some form as to what.
I don't believe the legislature established that. I think it's the department that established that matrix as part of the RFP. And we would do the same by basically saying, in the RFP, you have to, the revenue share model needs to be at least 25% or something like that. We would establish a minimum. We wouldn't just have it, there would be a minimum that they would have to meet in order for us to consider that. We wouldn't want to send it out and have them think that they could submit a bid that was a 5%. That doesn't interest us. Our interest is making sure that we maximize the revenue to the state, as well as putting in the consumer protections, as well as trying to stand it up by Super Bowl. So the way to do that is
I've heard you say that several times about Super Bowl. That's not what Tucker's saying. Tucker's talking about August, not February.
So I think that Tucker is talking about having the ideal situation is to take advantage of the NFL season.
Right.
There's no way at this late stage stage that we're going to have something up and running by August. I mean, I think the time frame that we're looking at is, at this point, we're looking at the end of the year, we could have something up. But New York State, for example, had theirs live January 1st. Within the first 5 days, granted, it's New York State, within the first 5 days, they, brought in $5 billion. So they took advantage of the Super Bowl. So while we're not going to have this up and running, maybe it's up and running by November. I don't know. It depends on how this is structured. So it's definitely not going to be up and running by August.
Well, and there's the house.
Well,
Up and running, I mean, I just think,
sure.
yeah, you're right. Ideally, it makes no sense if we can't probably have this up and running. There's no reason to push this hard at this juncture, at this point in the legislative season, if we can't get it up by November.
I would respectfully disagree, Senator Clarkson, with that. I think that as long as you have it up and running by the Super Bowl, which is what New York State did, then you can still take advantage of the Super Bowl and the March Madness season. I don't think that just because you can't get it up and running for the fall NFL season doesn't mean that you don't do it.
So the latter half of the NFL.
Correct, or the latter half of the season. I think that, I don't.
So one other question I had from what the work you guys did, which I saw very quickly, is you mentioned this about procedures. I had talked to Tucker about looking into rulemaking authority, maybe doing emergency rules, which would get things up and running, but then required to be followed up by formal. As the power that I saw you did was procedures, and you said procedures would have to force effective law, and yet the legislature really has no say on procedures. So could you tell me what your thinking was and what the differences are there?
Yes, the Administrative Procedures Act effectively has 3 different forms of rules. You have formal administrative rules. You have emergency rules, which are effective for 180 days, and which cut out some of the APA procedures for your formal administrative rules. Emergency rules have to be followed up at a later date after those 180 days are with final rules. Then the APA contemplates guidelines. Guidelines typically bind the internal operations of an administrative agency. And I will note, guidelines are what the department currently adopts to govern the lottery. So what is included in this draft takes that lottery guideline model, that language, and moves the sports betting provisions into that. So there is a 30-day public comment period for guidelines. There are 2 public hearings on guidelines before they're formally adopted. And that makes the timeline for these 45 to 60 days, potentially longer, depending on how the administrative agency wants to carry out the process. In addition to the guideline process, in this proposal, the sports betting study committee would have the opportunity to receive the proposed guidelines and provide comment along the way. This could easily be shifted into emergency rulemaking, followed by final rules. The timeline for emergency rulemaking is longer, and the duration of the emergency rules is shorter. And one of the reasons guidelines for this specific context might be favorable is that the effectiveness and the duration is longer than 180 days. And if you use emergency rules, that could impact the type of contracts you can get, the type of proposals you can get from the agents. If they know that the rules that are going to be governing the contract are only effective for 180 days.
You have a feel, Commissioner, if you would get any bidders, would it slow down the bidding process significantly if it was known that the legislature could interrupt a contract?
Yeah, that's one of the thoughts we had this weekend when Tucker and I were looking at this is, you talk about a contract and making it only be a year long, which basically is a pilot program. And then what does that do for the interest level? Is that an enough type? I mean, does that dissuade the vendors from applying if they know that at any point the legislature could come in and revoke or change the rules of the game? And I think that's a question for the industry. My guess is that that would be an impediment to wanting to participate. If you, I mean, it's a pretty, yeah.
Either that or not, I mean, because it would also, if the pilot was long enough, like 2 years, it could show how much Vermont could actually make.
Once you get the foot in the door and you start raising money, it's probably not going away, but it is a danger to the industry. On the other hand, some people in the industry don't want to take that risk. They want to be one of the first ones.
Hey, they're better, they're better.
They'll figure out the odds, right?
Yeah. Once the state has seen, after they've seen the financial parade, how are they ever going to return to Kansas? They just probably not.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions at this point, or Commissioner, do you have anything, or Tucker, anything more you want to share with us? We have a couple more minutes, but we could also break early.
I don't have anything additional to share with the committee.
So you have drafted an outline for this in a bill?
Yes.
Oh,
We could,
okay.
we could distribute that. I got it last night. So it's just,
And to be, the thought is to add it to, if we do this, to.
well, I don't think we're going to be able to change the study language as it to 157. So I think the only, give us, do this and give us more time to get more involved in this. Just do it on the liquor bill.
Or in finance. I mean, I mean, you began this conversation by saying, we have it in this committee, we are getting pressure for more revenue, which the governor I know is never very keen on, raising more revenue. But it seems to be in this case.
He is in this case.
Yeah, I get it.
You're saying maybe
So maybe
finance.
this could be a finance in addition to one of your finance bills.
The census is better than doing here.
I mean, I think we have
Yeah.
more interest here, and
Okay, I'm just trying to think of the right vehicle.
Less complexity.
You have the yield bill, and you have a bunch of miscellaneous things. So,
Yeah, so we'll get you a copy of that, but obviously it's just this was just an overview of the
yeah, no,
concept.
it gives us a notion of what might be possible, what time frame. So you think it would take you 6 months to get 5 to 6?
I mean, I can provide we sent the timeline to the committee in a memo, and I can certainly do that again. But
totally.
It was a while ago, yeah.
yeah, I mean, and then this is what Tucker and I went through, based on this particular sketch, right? This is the proposal in a bill written that talks about the guidelines and the 30 days. And so I'll send you the estimated schedule.
And do we have a fiscal note yet on this? No. Do we have a notion of
No.
what?
But this, you know, is basically building in the 30-day for the public hearing, and things are happening, you know, it's simultaneous. So we would be looking at developing the regulations in the RFR. I'd have to go and get it, but
Is there, I don't mean this to say that neither of you are super expert in this area, but can you think of like a witness we could have, who's like a national pro in developing or the development of these programs that could
yes.
give us some comfort level?
Yes,
that
we
this-
have a consultant that we use for the lottery who has a sports betting expert. We're happy to bring him in. I think we've offered him as a testimony. You also can have the commissioner from New Hampshire,
And New York, I mean, New York set it up the fastest. is that
correct?
right?
And so we could get the person who's running the sports betting in New
Pros
York.
and cons of that.
Yes, so we can certainly do that. New Hampshire, New York, and then our consultant.
Maybe Chris
And
has
we also-
something.
we also
Well,
have
obviously you have the experts.
History here. See her, I mean, I think enough has been said today to have another hearing. And I'll get you their draft, I don't think it's gonna help you.
Yeah, I think
I bet on the House may change a bit, given the enthusiasm with which they dive into the, what's the basketball thing called again?
Bracket?
March Madness. I have to say, the enthusiasm for that on in the other body is extreme.
Right, so I think, you know, my hope is that they're more open to it now than they have been, mostly because it seems like a lot of states are jumping on the bandwagon, trying to find money. So I mean, where a couple of years ago, they might have thought this was a novel, somewhat novel idea, it's becoming less and less so. You know, it'll just be a matter of time before we're the last state to do it.
Well, I will say that something I found out recently, we actually allowed deer pools in Vermont. So I would argue that that's like the precursor of sports betting, and that we allow deer pools. So there is precedence for that.